This is the Concept Capers landing page at conceptcapers.com. The reason I wanted to review this is that it's an example where someone's really committed to a visual style and all of the ways they've done that while keeping it relatively simple visually. So you can see it's this sort of cartoony style to the illustrations on these cards that are scrolling through automatically. And they've taken that style and applied it to the rest of the website in a few different ways, which I'll go through now. The first one is just that you can see around these illustrations, they've got the thick black borders. They've then applied that to other places where it's appropriate. So the cards themselves, this container, for example, this main navigation sort of sticky container. And you'll see that more throughout as well, or you can see it here around this little title. So that's applied throughout. You can look for that, and that's quite a nice way. They've just brought the visual style of the illustrations out to everything else as well. The second is that the typeface they've used for the cards is used throughout the website, and actually this is part of the marketing they're doing. They're saying that you can buy the typeface that's being used on both the cards and this landing page. But regardless of whether they were doing that, using the same typeface that you're using in your illustrations is quite a nice way to make everything feel like it belongs together. One thing you might notice throughout is that they've got these title containers which have a box around them, and then they're given a tilt, and that makes them feel more like the sorts of cards they're trying to sell here. So you can see cards here are tilted, this one's not so much, but when you're playing with cards on a table, for example, often they won't end up in perfectly straight lines. And so this tilt is both sort of fun and a bit more quirky than if the tilt wasn't there on this title section. But it also makes you think of those cards as well, because sitting tilted like this is something that probably a playing card would end up doing, right? So it supports the concept. One other thing I want to point out as I go through, but I'll point out here, is that each of these cards has a color, and they've used this concept of a set of these sort of lighter, more approachable pastel colors throughout the website, and I'll point those out as I see them. So here's one example of that. You can see that as I hover over these characters in boxes, they light up in the sort of set of colors. So you can see it's like almost a spectrum, although it's not the rainbow spectrum, but it is the spectrum they've chosen essentially. And this is quite nice because if you've got this series of sort of accent colors you can use, if you use them throughout the website, and there'll be lots of opportunities to do that, that series of accent colors will make the whole website feel like it belongs together. And it's also a lot more variety. So one thing I usually do is I use black, white, and just one accent color. Here they've chosen black, white, and 5, 6 accent colors. They've pulled them back a bit so they're softer, more approachable, more pastel, and that makes it easier for them to use them across the site. But it also fits with this concept of cards where each card has a different background, and then they'll use those different background colors on other elements, especially here, the ones that are card shaped, throughout the site. This shape here has got these rounded corners, and those could have been pointy. I think most of us expect a star shape to have pointier corners, but just by rounding them here, that makes it an even more subtle reference to the sort of friendly, rounded visual style of the website. So even in these small places, you can use an icon or an image that ties in with the visual style. Again, you can see here the game is in a box, and that's got a slight tilt to it, so that they're using that throughout. I quite like I always like visible structure, especially when the visible structure fits together so nicely here. So you can see there's this section at the top that leads into this section with the moving text. There's no gap between them. It's just the lines, so they're basically fitting together like Lego blocks. Then down here, you've got this section and this section side by side, and they fit together perfectly. And then these three, and then this one. And so they're using that throughout, and I quite like that because it almost feels card-like as well. So this is a technique you'll see on other websites, and they won't necessarily be selling playing cards. But I think in this case, it makes quite a lot of sense because playing cards are so rectangular. To have this sort of bold layout where it's rectangles fitting together, especially if it does remind you of something like Legos or building blocks. That feels like it suits the concept in a relatively subtle way of sort of something fun and playful. One thing I did want to point out, which is often hard to see, is that I think all of the gradients or all of the background colors used in large containers like this are actually gradients. So I think this is lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. I can click this and find out. So A3D. Yeah, so it's a different color top and bottom, and they've done it so subtly that it's quite hard to notice. But that's quite a nice way to add a bit more visual texture to the page without making it feel like you're adding too much visual texture or making it feel a bit too visually complicated. You've got lighter at the top and darker at the bottom, but it's such a gradual change that you don't necessarily notice it, even though you do feel the improvement it makes. I wanted to point that out here, there, because it's more obvious here. So lighter at the top, darker at the bottom, and they also include this drop shadow when you hover over it. And these are buttons, judging by the mouse cursor or mouse pointer. So that sort of inset shadow is quite nice. Oh, speaking of shadows, I'd like to point out the transparent but solid shadows of the cards. That's quite a nice way to make something feel a bit more playful, and but still give it that depth, that sort of more realistic depth. So again, you can see here, even though this is a grey, it's not particularly an accent colour, and I think that's because you've got all these colourful characters in the foreground. You don't want the background to steal any attention. Even though this is a lighter grey, they're still using a lighter grey at the top and a darker grey at the bottom, so they still applied that sort of gradient effect, which is quite nice. Especially here, that makes more sense because the ground, as it's coming towards you, would potentially be darker, and the sky or the part in the background would potentially be lighter. So it adds a bit more depth just to this concept of a room that everyone's standing in. I quite like this divider just because they're taking their logo, which is the light bulb in the circle. They're putting it in the center of this sort of divider section, and they're making it stand out more, making it more of a centerpiece. By putting concentric circles around them with this animation. So they're taking the circular concept of their logo and finding a way to essentially visually expand that to take up the full width of this wide rectangle sort of divider section. And using the concentric circles is a nice way to do that. You can see here they've got these icons that represent, I assume, concepts related to the game or the company as a whole. And the icons would be relatively, not plain, I mean, they're quite friendly. They've chosen a good icon set for this whole concept, but they would be relatively plain in terms of the visual style, the visual interest, except they've added these, I assume they've added them manually, but they've added these circles to each icon, which again repeat those sort of pastel accent colors throughout. And so that helps you focus on a specific part of each icon. So that's quite nice that they've used that to highlight, a focal point. But it also makes everything feel more coherent because they're using this repeated set of colors again, like they've been doing throughout. And one other thing I wanted to point out was that most of these sections, you can see this one here, have the title with a black background and white text. Here. Okay, so this one's different, but that's because they've got a title up here. I think they didn't want it to interact too much visually to compete, maybe. But most of these, they've got this sort of reversed title in a black box. And I was interested to see that this is a similar container, but they've kept it in a white box. And then I realized that once you hover over this WonderMake logo, it all turns black. And so if you had this title section, this little subtitle in a black box as well, it would suddenly compete with this. So I like that they chose an inconsistent style there for a good reason. So it doesn't compete with the hover effect. I also like, again, it's more playful. I'm not sure if it's just this page or WonderMake's brand in general, but I like that they've got this changing icon that represents the O in their logo. That's a fun way to make the sort of logo more interesting, make it more engaging, but also not make things too more complicated because you're replacing a letter with this animation rather than having it, an extra element. And finally, they've got this section at the bottom about get in touch with different links. And when you load this in, these drop down from the top and scatter around, so it's physics driven. And that's quite a fun way to have a footer that suits the style of the rest of the page. And here at the bottom, you can see they've done this sort of final repeating colors or repeating background colors motif, made it slightly more obvious, but that is a nice way to tie the whole website together.